All right, welcome to the New Jersey Coastal Resilience Collaborative Technical Assistance Coffee Chat on the NJ PACT REAL for stormwater and flood hazards. This is the second of a two-part series where yesterday morning we discussed coastal protection and natural enhancements of the NJ PACT REAL. The recordings of these sessions will be uploaded and accessible on the NJCRC website. My name is Amanda Archer and I will be serving as your facilitator today. I work for the Coastal Training Program of the Jack Cousteau National Estuarine Research Reserve, and we are a partner of the NJCRC. For those who are here for the first time, the NJCRC is a network of coastal resilience professionals, and the purpose of this coffee chat program is to better facilitate connections between local communities and decision makers to build capacity towards resilience. This coffee chat was made available to you through the NJCRC Technical Assistance Coffee Chat Work Group. The NJCRC has many other work groups, ranging from ecosystem monitoring to municipal planning. The NJCRC connects you with practitioners working on resilience initiatives from a wide variety of sectors. If you're interested in participating in any of the NJCRC work groups or to sign up as an NJCRC partner, please fill out the contact form that will be linked in the chat shortly. I would just like to remind everyone that this session is being recorded and will be accessible on the NJCRC website at a later date. To view previous technical assistance coffee chat recordings, you can visit the Coastal Resilience News and Videos on the website. The views expressed during this technical assistance coffee chat are the presenter's own and do not reflect the official policies or positions of the New Jersey Coastal Resilience Collaborative or any of its organizational partners. You may use the Q&A or the chat feature at the bottom of your screen to ask questions during the presentation. We will do our best to address them during the Q&A panel at the end of the session. Also, using the Q&A feature allows you to submit questions anonymously. And so if you're joining us here today, I invite you to put your name and organization in the chat so we can know who's here with us. All right, so today we're going to talk about the NJ PACT REAL rules related to stormwater and flood hazards. Many of this covers topics related to the redefined extent of tidal flood hazards through the climate-adjusted flood elevation and the creation of inundation risk zone, or the IRZ, for future permanent or daily inundation, as well as stormwater runoff reductions and water quality treatment. I would like to introduce you to our panel speakers today, and this really highlights the cross-sector collaboration of the NJCRC. So to kick us off, we have Lindsey Massih. She manages the New Jersey Future Mainstreaming Green Infrastructure Program, working to move green stormwater infrastructure practices into a common practice. Prior to joining New Jersey Future, she worked on environmental policies and a long-range planning efforts as the environmental planner for the city of Jersey City. She's a certified professional planner and holds a master's degree in city and regional planning from Rutgers University. Anushi Garg is a senior analyst for the Environmental Defense Fund's Climate Resilient Coast and Watersheds program in New York, New Jersey. Anushi uses a collaborative and multidisciplinary approach to research and advocacy and policy development to develop solutions to society's everyday challenges through collaboration, participation, and collective dialogue. Christopher Schmitt has more than 34 years of experience in the environmental consulting industry as a strategic leader and visionary, serving as program director and environmental scientist in creating and implementing sustainable, resilient, and regenerative policies and projects to help clients mitigate the effects of climate change. His current focus is on helping people within communities to collaborate and find common interests with their natural world so that they can work together to become more resilient. Pritpal Bamhrah is a skilled planning professional who specializes in coastal vulnerability analysis, hazard mitigation, and resiliency projects. She creates decision support tools to help policymakers, planners, and communities comprehend and navigate the effects of climate change. In her role as senior research specialist at the New Jersey Climate Change Resource Center, Pritpal leads Climate Core projects, aiding municipalities in conducting vital climate-related vulnerability studies. And then we have Caleb Stratton, who is the Chief Resilience Officer for the City of Hoboken, New Jersey. He supervises implementation of the $230 million Rebuild by Design Hudson River project, flood risk reduction project, and Hoboken's microgrid project. Caleb has over 10 years of experience advising urban and suburban communities on sustainability and resilience issues. And so with that, I am going to kick us off with Lindsey, Massih, who's going to introduce us to resilient environments and landscapes, PACT REAL.
Thanks, Amanda. Morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining. I'm Lindsey, Massih, and I'm a program manager with New Jersey Future, and I cover our stormwater and climate adaptation policy work. I'm excited to be here today to give some background on the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection, or NJDEP's REAL rule proposal. REAL stands for Resilient Environments and Landscapes. And looking forward to participating in some discussion later on. Reminder to please use the Q&A function or the chat with some questions. Like I said, I'll be giving some background or a timeline on climate change related initiatives that New Jersey has been embarking on over the years. And I'll give a summary of how DEP's land use regulations are changing through the REAL rules. So what is REAL? This is from DEP's REAL rule website, which the link is up there on the slide. And it just gives you a sense of the purpose of the rule changes. So overall, DEP is modernizing or updating their land resource protection rules to better support communities, residents, and businesses in building their resilience to climate change related hazards, which include sea level rise, extreme weather, chronic flooding, and other impacts of our changing climate. And these rules will change how we build and rebuild in flood-prone areas, will change how we design stormwater management systems, and change how we build in relation to our wetlands to ensure that we are resilient to a changing climate. And this slide also, and I'll reiterate this in just a bit, but these are the rule areas that have proposed amendments, and I'll get to that in a little bit. So next I want to start with a timeline of NJ PACT. So REAL falls under the New Jersey Protecting Against Climate Threats rulemaking initiative. So I'll get there. So I wanted to go back in time, provide a summary of climate related initiatives from the past 10, 15 years to describe how we got here. So let's start with Superstorm Sandy. So this was back in 2012, as I'm sure we all know. And while projects and policies that manage flooding have been a priority well before Sandy, as a result of the storm, we saw major changes in our coastal communities, and there was more funding to raise homes, to plan for future flooding, and design and build flood protection projects. Sandy was a defining moment for New Jersey and how we think about flooding and risk in our state. In 2016, Rutgers convened the Science and Technical Advisory Panel to study sea level rise and changing coastal storms, so we can better understand current and future risk of flooding from rising sea levels and other impacts of climate change. And this resulted in a report that can be found on the New Jersey Climate Change Resource Center. A few years later, in 2019, Rutgers reconvened the panel and updated that 2016 report to reflect the latest understanding of sea level rise and other factors affecting flooding in New Jersey. Around that same time, Governor Murphy issued Executive Order 89, which did a couple of things, including creating a position for a Chief Climate Resilience Officer for New Jersey and created a state climate and flood resilience program. That program, which was outlined in the executive order, created a scientific report on climate change based on existing data and the best available science regarding the current and anticipated environmental effects of climate change in New Jersey. The report also resulted in other strategy and guidance documents, including sea level rise guidance for New Jersey and a climate resilience strategy for the state. Bringing us to NJ PACT, which is the topic of today's webinar. Governor Murphy issued Executive Order 100 in 2020, which directed DEP to adopt Protecting Against Climate Threats, or NJ PACT regulations to address climate change. As a response to Hurricane Ida in 2021, the state directed its attention to the inland areas of our state and announced the Inland Flood Protection Rule, which requires areas of New Jersey subject to flooding from rivers, streams, and increased rainfall to build to new flood elevations. So 2 feet higher than current FEMA elevations for the areas of our state subject to riverine flooding. Plus, the rule updated the statewide stormwater management rules to ensure that our stormwater management systems are properly sized to manage the increased rainfall that our region has been experiencing. And that was made effective in just last year, last July. And that brings us to the REAL rules, resilient environments and landscapes. Again, that's what we're talking about today, which mainly addresses our coastal areas, plus some statewide requirements for stormwater and wetlands. So this next slide, I'm going to go through briefly some of the climate science behind the rule change. Disclaimer, I'm not a climate scientist, but it's important to provide some background on the science or the justification that DEP has been using to inform these regulatory changes. So this slide covers the already adopted inland flood protection rule, which a lot of the regulation was based on a precipitation study of New Jersey. And the study found that we are experiencing increased annual rainfall, more frequent and intense rain events, which are expected to worsen in the future. So this is the rationale behind a lot of the the now effective inland flood protection rule. Also, Hurricane Ida case studies showed average flood elevations 3 feet higher than FEMA's 100-year flood elevation, showing that inland flooding and how we build in those areas should be addressed. The next slide for REAL, the REAL rules, DEP is using the Rutgers advisory panel report that I mentioned earlier, and the study's sea level rise projection data. This table is from their report, their updated report from 2019. I added the green and red boxes to call out what planning horizon, what greenhouse gas emission scenario, and what range of likelihood the department is using to get to their selected sea level rise scenario to inform the REAL rules. So broadly, using a planning horizon of 2100 and a moderate emissions scenario, we end up with 5.1 feet and an estimated 17% likelihood that sea level rise will exceed this amount. So this captures about 83% of scenarios. So these assumptions are where we get 5 feet of sea level rise, which you'll see in a moment when we cover changes to New Jersey's flood hazard area rules. Again, I just want to give that brief background on the science that DEP is using. So next slide, please. So we also want to underscore uncertainty is inherent to science. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, has addressed the issues of uncertainty that goes along with evolving science and projections. So low confidence does not mean lower quality than a high confidence estimate of sea level rise. Instead, confidence is used to qualify the degree of agreement and level of evidence around the processes that are used as inputs into the sea level rise estimates. So for New Jersey, the 2019 Rutgers panel report addresses uncertainty by accounting for a number of possible factors. And this is the result, and the end result is an effective and usable range of projections, providing guidance for a solid set of land use regulations. So these, the next slide shows the land use rules that are proposed to change through REAL, includes the Flood Hazard Area Control Act rules, Coastal Zone Management rules, Stormwater Management rules, and the Freshwater Wetlands Protection Act rules. There are other rule areas that reference these first 4, but the major changes are reflected in the first 4 on this list. And this is a lengthy rule proposal. It's over 1,000 pages. And today we're just going to cover the flood hazard rules and stormwater, which is still a lot. We're going to do our best to summarize those changes. So Anushi's going to cover, yes.
Thank you. So we are having some technical difficulties connecting with Anushi. She's out of the country right now. So Lindsey, I'm not sure if you're able to touch on a little bit of her slides or not. Or we could jump to Chris and see.
I will do my best.
Okay.
Why not?
You're killing it.
All right. So I'm gonna do my best to cover the flood hazard rules, but this slide, you can keep it here for a second. I want to emphasize the areas of New Jersey that are impacted by REAL. So REAL mainly addresses the tidal portion of the flood hazard rules where, like I covered before, the already adopted inland flood protection rule addresses fluvial or riverine flooding. So tidal flooding generally is flooding from the ocean with a stormwater influence, and fluvial flooding is flooding from rivers with a stormwater influence. But there are areas along the coast subject to both, and there are rivers that are tidally influenced. So think coastal cities along rivers, Jersey City, Hoboken, which REAL addresses. But broadly, areas subject to both fluvial and tidal have more stringent requirements in DEP's land use regulations. Again, think municipalities along the Hudson, Hackensack rivers, plus communities along the Delaware Bay Shore, which this map is showing. It's showing a map of New Jersey's coastal municipalities. So when we say our coastal communities, we aren't just talking about the Jersey Shore. REAL also impacts our coastal cities and the Delaware Bay Shore. So while I'm not as familiar with Anushi's slides, I'm gonna do my best. Just give me 1 second. So one of the main changes to the flood hazard rules, sorry, just give me 1 second. So one of the major changes is DEP has proposed a new definition for climate adjusted flood elevation. And this is calculated, think back to that the scientific technical advisory panel report, that 5 feet. The new flood elevation that DEP is proposing is calculated by adding 5 feet to FEMA's 100-year flood elevation for tidal flood hazard areas. So what does this mean? It means that the flood zone jurisdictional area is moving further inland. So there are more areas in New Jersey that are now considered in the flood zone. Residential first floors for new or rebuilt buildings must be raised 6 feet above base flood elevation. Commercial uses also raise 6 feet, but there are some exceptions for that first floor if there's wet or dry flood proofing and the degree of risk. So for example, if a property is subject to wave damage, they're not permitted to have commercial below that 6 feet. And roadways generally new roadways must also be raised by 6 feet. Again, I'm sure you know roadways, it's a more complex process to raise roadways. So there are a series of exceptions to that requirement. Go to the next slide. So this is from DEP, this graphic here. This is just showing roughly the location of the limits of the climate adjusted flood elevation. In addition to the climate adjusted flood elevation, there is a new, it's called an inundation risk zone, or IRZ, and this applies to a portion of the flood zone that has been identified as being subject to increased risk of daily or permanent inundation due to sea level rise. So this graphic, this yellow line is showing an approximate extent of the IRZ, showing that it applies to a higher risk portion of the new flood zone. So the limits of an inundation risk zone on a particular site are determined there's methods outlined in the rule change. It requires the applicant for a project in this area to provide the data. Also requires them to do an on-site alternatives analysis, disclose impacts to adjacent roadways. And I also want to note that the inundation risk zone applies to just residential and critical facilities. So I kind of just covered this. Again, this refers to the land that's above sea level today, but in the future will be under permanent standing water. The next slide is another graphic showing current and future shoreline, and where roughly just a graphic showing the impact on a structure in that area. Again, what are the impacts of a rising sea level on our coastal communities? Yeah, I covered this a bit. Again, the main 2 changes I'd say with the flood hazard rules are the changing flood zone, this new definition for a climate adjusted flood elevation, and the inundation risk zone. And this site lists those requirements that I was getting at earlier. That second bullet under the inundation risk zone showing the requirement to submit an inundation risk assessment, to do an on-site alternatives analysis. I think what this means is to consider a different site layout if it would provide additional protections. What I'm not totally sure of is if an alternative is not identified, what is the process for moving forward? Does this mean certain projects can't move forward? That's something that we're still trying to understand. And overall, I think the purpose is also just acknowledging risk of building in these areas. And coastal hazard. Yeah, I think I covered everything that's on that slide. So I think the next couple slides are showing some mapping. So there's, I think this is from NJ GeoWeb, which you all are able to access. We can put the link in the chat if helpful. So there is on NJ GeoWeb under the water layer, once you launch that mapping tool, there is a layer that shows the new extent of the flood zone. If maybe the next slide shows that. So I think this is just, can you just go forward one slide just so I know what's next? Okay, so if you go back one, everything shown in blue, that's the current flood zone, the FEMA flood zone. And then the next slide, everything in orange is showing the changing extent of the flood zone. So as you can see, there are a large number of properties that are now considered in the flood zone. So everything, any new project proposed in this area or any rebuilt structure must now be, for residential, commercial, must now be raised 6 feet higher than FEMA regulations require. So yes, if you're curious what the impact is on your municipality, your project, this mapping tool is available. Again, it's NJ GeoWeb if you want to see if your property would now be considered in the flood zone. And thinking back to earlier, I think it's important to recognize that there are areas, especially during Sandy, that were not mapped as flood prone and Hurricane Ida. So part of this initiative is to capture that our existing flood zone or FEMA flood zone does not account for actual risk that we're seeing with these increased rain events and more frequent storms. I think we already covered this. So what does this mean for buildings? Again, for residential, first floor must be at or above the climate adjusted flood elevation +1. So that translates to 6 feet. Commercial or industrial buildings can be elevated 6 feet or flood proofed or both. But habitable areas must be dry proofed, and enclosed areas below the lowest floor can be wet flood proofed. In all buildings, there's not permitted to have any enclosures below the new flood elevation, and habitable areas cannot be wet flood proofed. And there's a new requirement for dry access. So in certain circumstances, dry access, so you need to be able to access via a roadway, a motor vehicle surface to access the building. So 6 feet higher than the flood elevation to get to the building. Again, this is complicated to raise roadways, so there are a series of exceptions to raising roads. And this is just another view of that earlier graphic that showed that the yellow line of where the inundation risk zone is located. So just showing current sea level, future anticipated sea level, and in relation to how buildings should be constructed in the future. Sorry, these are the first time I'm seeing these, but this is another image showing what the difference between dry and wet flood proofing is. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to Chris, who's going to talk about the stormwater rules. And so this is what I just talked about, covers, again, tidally influenced areas in New Jersey. Chris is covering the stormwater rules, which are statewide rules, so not just coastal, any project subject to stormwater rules. So I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Lindsay. I knew you had like a certain level of expertise on that presentation, so thanks for doing that on the fly. Really appreciate that. So we're going to pass it off to Chris now.
Yeah, thanks, Lindsay. That was a good job. That was very good. So hey, guys, Chris Schmitt here. I'm a senior consultant for sustainable communities at GZA GeoEnvironmental in Hamilton in South Jersey. Homeowner in Lower Township, Cape May, about 5 or 6 or 7 blocks from the beach, Delaware Bay Beach. So this is very personal. So I'm gonna have a little bit of different presentation here and have some fun and make this personal. I'm gonna talk a little bit about myself, not so you can hear me talk about myself, but because I think it's important that as you hear me talk about things that are personal to me, that you think about what's personal to you with respect to your life, your property, your family, etc. So next slide, please. So this is, I have a farm up in upstate New York. This is a picture of my farm. The reason for the ride is a funny saying my wife and I have about, why do we go for a ride on a motorcycle? The reason for the ride is my wife. My wife, is the reason why I have my philosophy and my psychology of what I'm doing here. And a reason I want to bring this up is that this completely and totally applies to how we go about our approach to New Jersey Real and other life-changing events and rules in our life. So, finding purpose, having no fear, family and future are, for me personally, why the reason for the ride. So next slide, and that's just like zoom away. So that insert your photo here. Where is your life intersect with this? Okay, so my farm, so again, the original meaning of the word farm in Old English was strong, a fixed agreement. My purpose in showing this is we have a fixed agreement with ourselves, our families, our communities, and our nature. We have an agreement, and we need to uphold that agreement. How do we uphold that agreement? Well, in my mind, for what I'm doing personally, is I'm regenerating for the future. I have a farm I'm going to give to my kids as their legacy. I have purpose in my work, okay? My job at GZA as a consultant is to help my clients, mostly municipalities and commercial businesses, to achieve resilience. Next slide, please. So there's the bee flying through, okay? So now, Amanda, here on these slides, I'm gonna have you click through a few different things here. Now, this is an existential crisis. Climate change is an existential crisis, and we need an existential solution. We're here. We're a part of nature. We need nature-based solutions that New Jersey Real is calling upon, okay? We have to turn problems into opportunities. We cannot avoid these problems. They need to become opportunities, okay? We can work together for the future, and nature is a collaborator, not a competitor. Nature does not compete. You might hear about competition. It really isn't competition, it's collaboration. All right, keep going there. And we all need to work together for the future. So there's my son, Zach. My son, Zach, and my daughter, Zoe, helped make these slides, and I really appreciate it. My wife was a wonderful inspiration as far as the philosophy. So what I do, I build sustainable communities. You can hear me talk about people. This is about people and nature, okay? Interdependence and regenerating for resilience, okay? Next slide. Okay, as far as green stormwater infrastructure, okay? You've heard the slogans perhaps: slow it, spread it, sink it, store it, okay? Chris Abrupta at Rutgers, Zach and I took the Green Infrastructure Champions course last year. It was fantastic, that 20-week course. You can do it too. What we're trying to show here is at my house, small scale residential, you can do these things. We are unlawning presently in our Cape May house. We have rain barrels, we have rain gardens. Next slide. Large scale commercial works too, okay? As far as green stormwater infrastructure, right? Libraries all over New Jersey are getting funding to do rain gardens and bioswales, have pervious pavement in their parking lots. The idea is if you can capture the first 1 inch of stormwater that rains on your property, and if you can slow it, spread it, sink it, store it on your property, just 1 inch of rain, 95% of our stormwater flooding problems will be eliminated in New Jersey, okay? We have other photographs showing different ways you can have some green infrastructure that are more complicated, more expensive. Terrace stream beds, drought tolerant landscaping. We're doing some drought tolerant landscaping at our house. It's really pretty fun and cool. It's interesting. And it's also us doing our job personally to try to help our community. Next slide, please. Okay, so in New Jersey Real, okay, what's required? So I just picked out a few things that are important. So what's this maximum 3% impervious cover, okay, in the inundation risk zone? So Lindsey talked about the IRZ, okay? This is a new zoned area where the future flooding is either permanent, in other words, it's underwater permanently, or it regularly floods, like often, like more than once a month kind of idea. So the full moon, whatever, brings in flooding, okay? So this critical environmental site is a new term that's added to the New Jersey Real rules, okay? The idea is it protects sensitive shorelines and natural systems from development/overdevelopment, okay? It applies to properties in the IRZ, okay, where the risk of flooding is permanent or regular. Regular meaning very often, okay? This applies to new development, redevelopment, or substantial improvements. So remember, substantial improvements is more than 50% of the property value. So a homeowner who is adding on a new porch or a new garage, or perhaps even adding a second story, probably would not be affected by this rule because your property value itself, your land value and your building value are combined to figure out whether it's more than 50% of the land value. The idea is this encourages nature-based solutions for building protections at the shorelines. Next slide, please. Okay, so why is this necessary? Why is it necessary to have this 3% impervious cover? Okay, well, because it's been found in studies by Rutgers and others that marshes trap sediments that come in from the tides. And what happens is the sediments start to gain elevation over time, building up natural dunes. So if you have a natural zone that's not covered by impervious structures such as houses or parking lots, etc., that the tidal action of the ocean or the Delaware Bay will allow sediments to build up over time and build dunes. So also marshes provide attenuation to waves. 15-foot width of marsh can attenuate 50% of a wave's energy. Massive amount of natural solutions to this. So living shorelines are great because they're much more resilient than hardened structures such as bulkheads or seawalls or jetties, which can often cause their own problems of erosion going out seaward. Next slide, please.
Hey, Chris, we have a quick question. Can you elaborate on the 3% impervious cover?
Sure, yeah. So, okay. So in New Jersey Real, there's a new requirement that if you have a new development that's in the IRZ, okay, which is a very limited space, okay? It's the area that's assumed to be flooded or often underwater, okay? You must have no more than 3% impervious cover, a building or a driveway. This is for new development. So existing houses, existing buildings don't count, okay? So the idea is really have the shoreline where it's be flooded have very little impervious cover of asphalt, concrete, or buildings, okay? Thanks, Amanda. Okay, next slide. Okay, so water quality treatment, okay, is required under New Jersey Real. This is more of a stormwater associated with what's happening is the state would like people, both residents and commercial properties, to when stormwater, rainwater lands in your property, to keep it on your property for as long as possible. So number one is to reduce runoff, and number two is to try to increase water quality. So when water lands in your property, if you have a commercial strip mall and water lands in your asphalt, it runs off into a storm sewer system, and it often carries pollutants such as oils that drip from cars, etc. And it goes into a stream and it pollutes the stream. So there's a new requirement that for redevelopment projects that you're required to try to treat your stormwater to try to improve the quality of water as it enters the streams. There are total suspended solids, TSS, are materials that are associated with sand, silt, depositional materials blown onto your property that flow into the stream that cause turbidity, etc. Okay, so parking lots that have new parking lots that are increased in capacity are going to require water quality treatment. Okay, there are different kinds of treatment systems. So I have green infrastructure, GI. Okay, green infrastructure is like a nature-based solution for stormwater. Okay, pervious pavement. Pervious pavement is pavement that can receive stormwater, and stormwater will percolate through it to the ground beneath it rather than running off into a stream. Bioswales are like ditches that have natural plants in them that slow down the spread of stormwater off your property, and sometimes in certain configurations can filter the water. Rain gardens, often seen both at residential and commercial properties, okay? So the idea is to try to remove the total suspended solids down to remove 80% of them. So only 20% of TSS is able to leave your property, okay? Manufactured treatment devices are engineered devices that are used for commercial properties. You're not going to see it on a residential property. And they are really good at treating high volumes of water. And they're usually done with filtration and sedimentation. Next slide, please. So the idea, why is this necessary? Why do we need to do this as part of New Jersey Real? What's the requirement? What's going on here? Well, the idea is we want to manage stormwater on or close to the property on which it lands. We want to slow it, spread it, sink it, store it. I'll say it over and over again. We want to send that water into our subsurface because anybody who's been trying to grow things in New Jersey this summer, you might have noticed it was really rainy and they got really dry. So we had flooding and drought, okay? So on my property, I wished I had a huge storage space for my water so that when it flooded, I could store it and then I could save it for when we had droughts. And so we have rain barrels and we have some fire ponds, etc., that we use for that. But I think it's a really good thing for everybody to do to try to have some way of storing water on your property, okay? So basically, the idea is having vegetation on your property that slows the stormwater from leaving your property and filters it. All right, next slide, please. Okay. TMDL, total maximum daily load. I'm sorry, load, not limit, load. The idea, this is kind of like a pollution budget for stormwater pollutants, okay? The idea is there are certain streams in New Jersey that are overburdened with pollutants, and they have limits of what kinds of pollutants can be discharged into the stream from anybody's given property, whether it's commercial, industrial, etc. Okay, so for example, let's say phosphate from an agricultural property, from herbicides, pesticides, and fertilizers. So there are certain streams in New Jersey that have limits of how much pollutant can receive, how much phosphate pollutant they can receive. And so there's a spreadsheet on New Jersey DEP's website that shows you which water bodies have which limits of TMDL. So the idea is that we know what streams can receive what kinds of pollutants, and if we have those pollutants on our property, as an industry or commercial or agriculture, we need to limit the amount that leaves our property and goes into a stream. So how do you do that? Again, with these green infrastructure projects and some of these engineered products, okay? So there's a new thing here. The last bullet is this permit by certification. You'll hear that a lot in New Jersey Real. It's a new thing of doing. You've heard of permit by rule. Well, now there's permit by certification. And the idea is that as people apply for permits, that there's a list of which entities, which property owners, commercial property owners, industrial property owners, which farms have certain pollutants. And the state can track these and they can make judgments and evaluations about the effectiveness of these rules. Okay, next slide. Okay, so why do we need to have the TMDL, load regulation? Well, so again, obviously improve water quality. Water quality is, we're trying to do two things with New Jersey Rule as far as stormwater. We're trying to reduce flooding, physical flooding, and we're trying to improve water quality. So TMDLs have to do with water quality. We want to see improved streams in New Jersey for wildlife, aquatic life, plant life, okay? So we need to have major developments which are greater than 1 acre generally. Generally, a major development is greater than 1 acre of disturbance. Okay, there are some exceptions to that. They have to have these limitations on their discharge of pollutants to stormwater, which is going to go to a stream. Okay, we use best management practices and green infrastructure to do that. Next slide. Okay, so in summary, New Jersey Real benefits your community. Okay, you personally, all right, creates more resilient properties. I can tell you there's studies, New York Times just came out with it, higher property values, higher resale values. Yes, some of these improvements do cost money, but they will increase your property value, okay? You're going to have lower property insurance. Okay. We know that for a fact, that people who go and take on these really important improvements to their properties, they're going to have lower commercial and residential property insurance. You have lower maintenance costs because if you use green infrastructure, you can have drought tolerant plants, and you're not going to have as much water use, etc. Okay. So risk management, both as a resident and as a business owner, we're going to start seeing more and more conversation about the risk management approach to climate change mitigation. Okay. You're going to have a reliable infrastructure to sustain your lifestyle, and you're going to leave a legacy for your future generations, like I'm going to do for my kids. Next slide. Okay. So thanks very much to my family for helping with this, and I thank you all for being here today.
Thank you, Chris. There's a couple of technical questions in the chat, but we'll try to address them later. Right now, I'm going to move on to Pritpal, who's going to give us some resources that communities can use in their resilience planning.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you, Chris. That was great. And my daughter did not help me with my slides, so I'm going to go over them now. So I'm here. I'm at Rutgers. I work on a lot of tools, which are called NJDEP, and many of you might already be familiar. I'll just quickly go over what the resources we currently have that can help with the real rules, and also what our future plan is when it comes to the new real rules. So just quickly, NJDEP is a suite of tools which has been being developed at Rutgers for more than 10 years now, and focuses on climate adaptation planning. We want to assist planners, communities, businesses, residents, municipalities to understand what the challenges New Jersey is facing right now. The tools, we have about 10 tools or data sets or the whole suite has 10 of them right now. And they are geared for different purposes. We have dashboards, we have downloadable reports where the analysis is already done. So I encourage you to go and take a look of all of them. For today, I'll quickly open the mapping tool. I'll share my screen and go over it. Quick disclaimers, the NJDEP data sets are for information and planning level tools only. They are not to be used for any permitting or legal purposes. And also, everything should be verified with a site visit or technical engineering drawings when required. So I'm going to quickly share my screen. So you can go to NJDEP page through New Jersey Climate Change Resource Center, and under the project area, you can find NJDEP. Once you go, you will see all the tools lined up like this. So I'm going to go to Flood Mapper and show you a couple of things. So this is just a quick disclaimer that comes. So I'll go to flood hazards and just quickly tell you what are the most relevant things, but you can explore all of these things. And if you have questions, you can reach out directly to me. So the first thing is sea level rise. We have sea level rise from 1 foot to 10 feet in 1 feet increments. And for these specific rules, 5 feet is most important, which is the IRZ. So you can just click on the green button and add it. And for convenience, I'm just gonna zoom into Atlantic City. To see, you can go over and look at other sea level rise scenarios here. Specific to these rules, what we wanted to do is bring in the climate adjusted flood elevation within our tool. So to make it easy, I know you can easily find it at DEP's GeoWeb too, but I'm just gonna turn this off for now. And the last one you see, we just added this. So you can add directly this layer within the flood mapper. And the most important thing that it helps is because we have a wonderful array of a lot of other tools that you can then pull in and look at, what the impact is, especially for transportation. You can go to transportation and add hurricane evacuation routes, and you can see which ones there are, which are affected and which are in this zone, and if there is any redevelopment required for this, how municipalities can plan that. So that is a great resource. Other layer that I would like to for us to look at facilities, we can look at schools, fire stations, hospitals, etc. What are the ones which are impacted? And everything is clickable. So once it comes up, you can click on the little dot or symbol that comes in, and it gives you all the information about the point that you're looking at. The other thing I just wanted to quickly show was, yes, under infrastructure, we have wastewater treatment plants. So we can go and we can look at the existing wastewater treatment plants, where they are they within these new flood areas, and if we need to plan new ones, where's the right place to put them. So this mapping tool really helps with everything. So that's all that I wanted to show you on the map. For our future enhancements, just one thing, sorry, I missed. Under flood hazards, I'm just gonna quickly say that we added this New Jersey inland design flood elevation. This is geared towards the inland flood protection rule that came out earlier, which calls for FEMA 100-year layer plus 3 feet. So we have this layer right now. I'm gonna quickly add it, and I'm gonna turn this layer off. So that's how it looks like. So I know there are some stormwater calculations which are actually based on the inland design rule. So this is where you can go and find this layer and use this for any analysis that you are going to do. So these are the main layers or flood hazards that you can look at in the flood mapper right now. What our future vision is to do more analysis, take the inland flood protection layer, the climate adjusted flood layer, and do more analysis and have downloadable reports of the ones that we have within our climate snapshot. So if you go to climate snapshots, you can select your county and municipality and directly look at the results of infrastructure or critical assets. So for now, we have the flood, the total water level, or you can look at it as sea level rise of 2 feet, 5 feet, and 7 feet. Going forward, we would like to add the inland flood protection 100 plus 3 and 100 plus 5 for the real rules, and have them in this kind of format. So that's our future vision, where we are taking our tools with respect to the new upcoming rules. So that's all I have, but if you have questions later, I can answer them. Thank you, Amanda.
Awesome. Thank you, Pritpal. All right, so we are going to move on to Caleb Stratton, who's the Chief Resilience Officer of the City of Hoboken, and he's going to talk a little bit about what his community has already done in this space and his perspective. So thanks, Caleb.
Thanks, Amanda. I heard that Matt's segment yesterday was very well received. So in addition to being the Chief Resilience Officer for the city, which means I'm managing capital projects that address shocks and stressors, I'm also the Assistant Business Administrator. So I have the responsibility of trying to translate our goals related to flood risk reduction or adaptation throughout our other departments, and to manage how we interpret rulemaking or applying different codes, ordinances, and standards to building design and construction. So Hoboken's in a little bit of a different position in that really after Hurricane Irene and Hurricane Sandy 2011, 2012, our community came to us and said, we need to modify our behavior and our standards, policies related to everything from development on piers and platforms extending into the Hudson River to how we manage stormwater inland, or what are our design flood elevations in the floodplain. So our existing flood insurance rate maps are from 2006, and it roughly establishes a base flood elevation of 9 feet above sea level for most of Hoboken, which is characterized by topography that's like 4 or 5 feet above sea level. And so in 2014, we adopted the advisory base flood elevations, which jumped that 9 foot up to 12 foot. And for critical infrastructure up to 14 feet. So we did do like that 5-foot leap. This is going back a number of years now, and we further extended that to regulate outside of the coastal A into the 500-year floodplain. And we developed design standards to try and reconcile FEMA rules with NJDEP rules with our design flood elevations. And we tried to give tools to the community to help interpret and provide clarity through the development process, as well as undertaking structural and non-structural responses to managing flood risk, either through, and Chris had a little bit different way of saying this, but we call our stormwater management strategies delay, store, discharge, which is keeping water out of systems, modifying systems to expand their storage capacity, or looking at outfall elevations and introducing dynamic pumping, because most of our outfalls are below sea level right now. And I think that rather than comment on the rules themselves, my takeaway, and I think that my perspective, is that change is challenging at the governance level and at the community level. And I think that if you can develop a good story about why we're doing this at the local level, what's the purpose of implementing these practices, why is there a need for it, which this group has gone over, the basis for some of the rulemaking. As that gets into practice, there are challenges. So some of the things that we've confronted is, let's say you're 12 feet above sea level, and now the design flood elevation is at 14 feet, and you trigger substantial rehabilitation just because of moving that lowest occupied floor, which is a hardship for the homeowner. So there are all of these rules that end up creating these one-off challenges. And I think the important thing for local government is to reinforce, whether it's the existing risks are real, or the tolerance for future risk. There's an opportunity to engage and try to define what the importance of higher regulatory standards are. So I'll leave it there. I'd love to talk to the other panelists or if anyone has any questions. I had one question just listening today, and it was, who is establishing, or is DEP going to establish a base flood elevation outside of the regulated floodplain that would fall within that new 6-foot area? I don't know if anyone can actually answer that, but it's just a question that, as the extent and depth of the floodplain changes outside of what's been a modeled and regulated floodplain, I think it'll be helpful for municipalities to have clear guidance on where that new threshold is. So just for example, if the existing floodplain's at 9, you add 6, is that 15-foot static all the way out? Or does, as you get out to 12, 13, 14, are you now at needing to modify practice and go to 14, 15, 16, 17? And that's because of the future, really the expansion of the floodplain and the inclusion of sea level rise. So those are things that I think are going to come up in a lot of these communities, and what we try to do is just provide clarity and direction and certainty in supporting our residents and our development community. So thank you for your time. I appreciate being on the panel today.
Thank you, Caleb. I'll ask that all of our panelists come on camera. We're gonna dive into a couple of questions here. Lindsey, do you want to help clarify the 3% cover?
Well, it's my understanding that the 3% impervious cover limit applies to the coastal zone management rules, and specifically sites in the CAFRA area, the Coastal Area Facilities Review Act, based on a site's location in a designated center, core, or node as identified in the state plan. So there's impervious cover limits if you're in a coastal or CAFRA center, and there's a definition for critical environmental sites And that's where I've seen the 3% impervious cover limitation, because as someone pointed out, that's a very small percentage of impervious cover for a site. So it's my understanding that it's just for critical environmental sites that are mapped in CAFRA. And that the purpose of that is to encourage development in areas with existing development and discourage development in our sensitive areas where there's sensitive natural resources, hence such a low impervious cover requirement for that site. Maybe I was misreading, but I don't know if it really, I don't think it applies to the entire inundation risk zone. I think it just applies to those critical environmental sites in CAFRA. But Chris, welcome any input there. That's just how I've been
That's right.
interpreting
Yes,
them.
you said it
Okay.
perfectly. Thanks.
Because that's a little, it was a little, I think people were a little got a little spooked by that with the entire inundation risk zone, because that's a large area of the coast. So yeah, just wanted to clarify that. Thanks, Amanda.
Thank you. I'm not sure if we touched on this, just sticking to the 3%. Does the 3% mean 3% square footage of the property, of the entire property?
Yes.
And that's the idea. There'd be very little development. That's right. As Lindsey just said, the state is trying to discourage new building in these areas. So that's the idea, these sensitive areas. That's correct.
Thank you. Somebody wrote in the chat, I presume compacted gravel for the purposes of vehicular use would be considered impervious. Would uncompacted gravel not used for vehicular traffic count as impervious?
Yeah, yes. There are calculations you can make, and some compacted gravel might pass muster, but certainly uncompacted gravel would more than likely be sufficient. But there are calculations to be made with that. So yeah.
Okay, we have one open question. The climate adjusted flood elevation would define a proposed regulatory flood hazard area limit. Will the definition of a flood hazard area in the New Jersey Building Code be updated to incorporate this change?
Yes, because I believe it would reference DEP's definition of flood hazard rules. So I believe that would have to be like a subsequent step to update the building code to reference those new definitions.
Okay, one more. I get the new BFE at +6 feet, but what about the land elevations? When inundated, you can't get to the raised structures. Does this stop development?
I saw that one. I think I kind of interpreted that as what good is a raised structure if you can't get to it? Which I think that's the reason why dry access, what is referred to in the rules, is required, meaning you need to be able to access a building in the event of flooding. And this applies again just to new or rebuilt structures. So dry access in the rule means that a building or a subdivision must be served by a roadway of adequate size and capacity, and that is constructed 1 foot above this new climate adjusted flood elevation. So that's at 6 feet higher than FEMA flood elevation. So the intent of that is to require safe access to and from sites within a flood hazard area where there's large numbers of people or buildings. And I have read in the rule that roadways cannot be constructed below flood elevation unless the applicant demonstrates that each building is served by at least one existing or proposed roadway that meets the new flood elevation.
Awesome. Well, thank you to our panel. We have this final slide up here with our contact information. There, at the end of today's chat, you will receive a link for a post-event evaluation. Please fill it out. We would love to hear from you on how we did today. And thank you to all of our panelists. Anushi sends her apologies that she wasn't able to hop on. And thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Have a good day.